All right, y'all, latest request for a VA video was top 5 tips to make your Southwest Virtual Airlines flights smoother. I upped that to 10 because I thought I would throw some VATSIM related items in there as well, since a lot of people do like to fly on the network. Number 1, use your resources is the bottom line here. VATSIM resources, real world resources, which might include Google and YouTube on how to fly the aircraft. And Google, of course, can be great just for those real world references like when do I need to file an alternate, that sort of thing. The VATSIM page on the left side, you'll see Learning Center, and then of course we've got all these green buttons here. There's a great deal of information that just doesn't get used like it should. We get a lot of new pilots on the network that don't really understand how to fly the aircraft or how to communicate on the radio, and there's a lot of great resources here that just don't get used that pilots need to be using. There's a great deal of training that the controllers have to go through to control the network, but there's actually zero training that's required for the pilots other than passing an initial test. So get into the resources, get onto the VATSIM website and do a little bit of reading and research. Watch some videos on aviation, and that'll help you out tremendously. Now, under each one of these things here, we can see the different topics that are going to be discussed, and you can see that it's a wealth of information if you're just willing to get in there and take a look at it. Under the e-learning center, there's even more information, so don't forget to go over there and check those things out. Also, the SVA Life website, policies and procedures that are published on the website. Don't forget about that. Use that as well. Number 2, don't rush. Don't ever be in a hurry, whether you're flying this aircraft offline or online, particularly online. The last thing we want you to do is push off the gate and then you're not programmed, you're not ready to go. So again, you can read that. I won't read that whole thing to you, but just make sure that you're prepared and never in a hurry. Don't rush. If you ever feel like you're in a rush, it's probably not a good time to be flying on the network. Number 3, pre-flight planning, an emphasis on pre-flight planning, making sure all that stuff is complete at the gate like we had said for number 2 about not rushing. Use your resources, LC5, use the flight planning, weather, and performance modules, and of course, use Rachel to your advantage. Dispatch tab, OFP, I always add extra gas and then come back and take a look at my planned arrival fuel. So I bumped it up to 2,000 pounds there. You can see where it shows extra 2,000, and I still only came out with 6.3 of landing fuel. So make sure that you're always taking a look at your landing fuel. We did a video already on the OFP and dispatch release, so I'm not going to go over all these individual items, but I would say that, use this as a resource. Of course, you can do the uplink to FMC where you don't have to push all the buttons in the FMC. Let Rachel do that for you. That's a great resource there. Saves you some time and some effort. Cost index, we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. That's always a point of misunderstanding. Weather, departure weather, arrival weather, and then of course here we can search for any weather. That's a great resource. Performance tab, we've also done videos on this, so I won't go into a lot of detail on this today, but understand what these things are telling you. Get your flaps setting, your speeds, trim, clean up altitude, engine failure procedure, and then of course your runway information there at the bottom. So another great resource. The guys took the time to find the data and upload the data for you so that you could have this information. So use it. Again, uplink to FMC makes your life a lot easier. Have Rachel put all that information in the FMC for you. Use your co-pilot. Rachel's does great flows. Very good at her job procedurally, so use Rachel to do the flows and help you out with your checklists. I really like this page too because it gives a flow to the flight. It helps you to maintain your mental model of where you're at, your situational awareness. You start with your flight deck preparation. Once that's green and you've got all your everything set up, you can get into your checklists on the left side here, your before start and your before push checklist, your pushback procedure, start the engines, before taxi checklist, and then on. So it's a great way, once you understand the flow of the flight, to refer back to this page to see where you're at. Checklists, of course. Number 4, charts. It took me about 15 seconds to go to SkyVector and pull up an ILS runway 31 center chart for those that don't have or want to pay for a subscription like Navigraph. So I was able to find this very quickly. You're going to need to have current charts for a lot of different reasons. Plus, it's a VATSIM code of conduct thing now too. So you have to have current charts flying on the network, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The complexity of a lot of these things is the reason. A lot of the airport diagrams, you look at O'Hare, it's a spaghetti of taxiways. So if you're given those instructions by that controller, you need to be able to find that chart, find those taxiways, and taxi as instructed. Couple departures that I wanted to touch on very briefly here, because you'll see these most often on the network. Two different types of SIDs: a radar vectored SID, where you're given a clearance to a fix and you're told expect radar vectors to that fix. So a place like Midway, you're going to be given a heading off of one of those runways and then eventually told to go direct to. So perhaps you'll be given a turn off runway 31 center, maybe of a 250, and then told direct PQ. Read the entirety of the chart. Be familiar with the chart. There's usually transition information at the bottom. There's altitudes and airspeeds published on those charts. So you want to be familiar with the departure procedures that you're going to be using, particularly the altitudes, so that you don't fly through that initial altitude. The pilot nav SID is one where you'd fly LNAV off the ground, and your tower controller here may, off of 8 left, say RNAV Ronnie, runway 8 left, clear for takeoff. So you want to make sure that you've got all those fixes programmed properly in your FMC. This is one that's also going to be probably said, or you'll be told to climb via SID. It may not even be given an initial altitude. So there you need to go on the chart and find what that initial altitude is. In this case, 10,000 feet. Complexity. That's again another reason why you need to have current charts. Look at the taxiways there at LaGuardia, or even all those spots: 9 Alpha, 9 Bravo, 9 Charlie, 9 Delta, 9 Echo. You may be told to or taxi to any one of those spots. And of course, if you don't have a current chart, that's going to be a problem for you. LaGuardia 7, speed restriction here of aircraft filed over Biggie, Elliott, Lana, Newell Park, Zims. Do not exceed 250 knots until reaching 11,000 feet. So that's a little non-standard. That's something that we need to pay attention to. Also, what if you were departing off runway 13 center, 13, and told to do the Whitestone climb? Take a look at that and a textual description over here of the Whitestone climb, or even down here. Whitestone climb, climbing right turn to a heading of 180 to DME of 2.5 off LaGuardia, then a left turn to 040. So you can see how it's extremely important that you have current charts, and that's why VATSIM added it to their code of conduct. Of course, anytime you're loading up a route, go to route page 2, check that route. Also check the legs page. Check the legs. Also check the altitude and speed constraints and make sure that all that is programmed properly. Last thing we want you to do is go out on the network, not have these things programmed properly, and then controllers start getting upset. So again, that kind of goes back to the don't rush part. Make sure all that stuff is entered and verified. I just want to take a quick shot of the cruise page. Oftentimes, your flight planning software may give you an altitude that your aircraft can't achieve. Maybe you're too heavy. So we'd be, in this case here, with an optimal altitude of 40,400 feet, we would be too heavy for 41,000 feet. Now, it says max of 41. Yes, you can get there, but your low speed and high speed margins are not going to look very good for you, we'll say. So what I would usually do is take this number. If this was 40.5, I would say 410 would be okay. But in this case, if I was going east, I'd stay at 39,000 feet. Number 5, know your aircraft. That should kind of go without saying. I'm going to put this here and you can read that. These are all the different things that you should be able to do and be comfortable with doing in the aircraft, particularly flying on the network. You should be able to hand fly the aircraft. You should understand all the navigation systems, understand the FMC, how to program a hold, those sorts of things. Be able to fly an RNAV RNP approach. And if you're not comfortable doing all of those things, then that's a clue that you need to get on the VATSIM website, look at those resources, or start watching some YouTube videos. Of course, this is a Southwest VA, so we're flying the 737. Do you fully understand your EFIS control panel and all the buttons and switches here? Do you fully understand the MCP and all the buttons and switches and what every one of these modes does? VNAV, LNAV, your approach mode, how to deactivate approach mode if you've already intercepted the glide slope on the localizer or the ILS itself. Do you understand speed intervention, altitude intervention, how they work with a VNAV? If not, then get into some of the videos on the VA TV channel. Number 6, aviate, navigate, communicate. That's just a real world thing that sort of goes without saying. Fly the aircraft and then communicate with ATC. We would prefer to see you make that turn to intercept the localizer prior to reading back the instruction to turn and then turning, because oftentimes we're trying to shoot gaps. Number 7, radio etiquette and brevity. Again, another slide that you can read through. I'll tell you one thing that we really don't like on the network is all the radio checks. When you call for taxi, if we don't respond, then you'll know that your radio doesn't work. If we respond, you'll know that your radio works. It's really just that simple. So let's try to cut out the radio checks, please. Also, know what you want to say before transmitting. Again, go back, look at those resources on radio etiquette, brevity, and communications in general to understand the flow of communications. Use your resources. Back here on the VATSIM page, again, we have that tab where we can look at IFR communications, VFR communications flying in the United States. You've even got it there for flying in the UK. Required readbacks to ATC, runway hold short and crossing instructions, takeoff and landing clearances, approach clearances, and then any altitude, speed, or heading assigned. If we say climb and maintain level 310, you need to read back, climb and maintain level 310, Southwest 1. Nice information to have on check on with approach control or check on with the initial controller when you're getting your clearance or calling for taxi the first time would be the ATIS information. Number 8, IFR flying in ATC. Can I just descend on my own? You'd be surprised how many times on the network we see aircraft fly into the airspace and just descend. And we're kind of scratching our heads like, what exactly is this guy doing here? So maintain altitude, maintain heading, maintain speed until given something else. Movement versus non-movement areas. Another thing here that we get a lot is a lot of push calls that don't need to be made. For instance, the gray area here around the terminal ramp at Midway, particularly on the inside, that would be a non-movement area. No need to call for push there. You would simply call for push taxi up to hold short of taxiway Tango and call the ground controller there. Now, if you were on this side of the Bravo gates or on the end caps of the Bravo or Alpha gates, then you may need to call for push if you cannot remain clear of the movement area of the taxiway. Clearances, read those clearances very carefully. Take it one step at a time, line by line, and then enter that information in the aircraft where it's appropriate. For instance, we've got call sign equipment. We're going to go to O'Hare. Here's our squawk code. Obviously, we need to put that in the transponder. Final altitude of 36,000 feet. Couple places that goes. But then we've got our routing, departure frequency, altitude restrictions, climb via SID, top altitude 5,000 feet. The top altitude 5,000 feet there in the clearance isn't really real world, but there's been so many issues on VATSIM with pilots exceeding that initial altitude that a lot of places have started putting top altitude in the PDC. So read that, take your time, plug that information in. You were given the Goldman 8 departure, we'll say, as we saw in that PDC. Look at the fixes, look at the chart, look at the speed restrictions, look at the top altitude. Use Kiwi of 220, at or below 2,500 feet. Vobaz, max of 220, at or above 4,500 feet. Goldman, and then a vector, and of course the textual description is down here as well. Verify all those points in the legs page. Verify those altitude and speed constraints. Set up the entirety of the aircraft. Set up the MCP. In this case, we're going to set up 134 for our EFP. We've got 134 for V2. Coincidentally, we're also going to spin in runway heading. If you read that departure, you're going to get either a heading or, I can't recall exactly, but you get the point. Set the entirety up of the MCP. Activate VNAV, LNAV if that's what you're intending on doing. Verify it in the FMA. Also set up your transponder and set up your departure frequency. All of this before you push off the gate. TARA, that's what we need to see as the controllers to be able to see your data block in the controller software. Again, the cruise altitude we can verify. IFR versus VFR. What can I do? IFR, don't do anything unless you're told. We talked about that already when it comes to climbs and descents, turns, and speeds. Airspace train obstructions, well, if you're flying IFR, the controller is essentially taking responsibility for your train and obstruction clearance and also any sort of airspace restrictions. VFR is a little different. I always thought VFR flying was harder because you're responsible for those items yourself as opposed to that being on ATC. Speed restrictions, do not forget, we always do 250 knots below 10,000 feet. And speed restrictions mostly come from ATC. ATC may not assign a speed adjustment to an aircraft in holding pattern or inside the final approach fix, but what you will often get is maintain 170 knots or greater to a 5-mile final, and that's very doable in a 737. Additional considerations: when given a descent via and the descent but then given a descent and maintain, but still along the lateral definition of the SID, those speeds that are published on that arrival still apply. If you're cleared for an approach, so for instance, cleared the ILS runway 28 center approach, any previous speed restriction is canceled unless amended by ATC. So perhaps you were given a speed of 210 on a base leg or a downwind, but then cleared for the approach. The 210 now is void. However, the controller may say, as I said previously, maintain 170 knots to a 5-mile final. That speed, of course, is then expected. Know your jet, know when to configure and slow fly a proper approach. Slowing the final approach speed on a 15-mile final will only cause trouble for everyone around you. I'm not going to read all those to you there, but that is the different IFR reports, required reports to ATC. One that you might encounter more than any of the others would be the fourth one here, unable to climb or descend at a rate of at least 500 feet per minute. In that case, I would just tell ATC, hey, it's going to be a slow climb to flight level 400. Profiled versus non-profiled stars, we kind of talked about these already in another video, but we'll touch on them very briefly. A non-profiled star, now this is a bad example because it very much looks like a profiled star, but if you're going into Chicago on the Pang, we'll typically tell you to cross Pang at 11,000 feet and Haley at 6,000 feet and fly whichever transition. The ND6 is absolutely a descent via. Now, if you're gonna take a look at which runway transition you're going to and find the lowest altitude. So, for instance, if you're going to runway 31 center, you come back this way, you see Stickney at 6. So, if you're given a descent via, you're going to put 6,000 in the MCP window and descend in the path. Of course, there are some speeds on there, so again, keep a lookout for the speeds. Again, go back to understanding VNAV and what these different buttons do for you, this particular altitude intervention. If you have questions you need to ask in the Discord or start watching some videos. Through this chart in here, because the ILS 28 Center at Chicago, now I'm going to show you the legs page. Keep in mind, we've got Hazel all the way out to Vogler here. And if we look at the FMC, and all I do is simply load the approach, what do I get? I get Hazel, Seika, and the runway. I do not get anything beyond Hazel. So the point of this slide here is make sure you're always loading a transition. Look at the chart, look at your star, see if the star and the approach tie in anywhere. If they do, load the transition where they tie in. We're going to load up Vogler, and instead you'll see that I get a whole bunch more points here in my legs page. Now I've got Vogler all the way in to Hazel. So make sure that you're always loading a transition. Double check that frequency. If you get a runway that's an assignment that is other than what you had previously programmed, don't forget to tune up the proper ILS frequency. We don't want to give you a vector and tell you to intercept the ILS runway 28 center and see you go over to 27 center. Top of descent tasks, tip I can give you for flying the aircraft. This is what I always go through my ABCs at the top of descent or prior to top of descent. Grab the ATIS, build the approach. So in other words, put it in the FMC, bug the approach, your course, your barometric altitude, and your frequency. Also, don't forget your performance data in that, setting your VREF and your target speeds. Brief the approach, run your checklists, descent checklist, eventually your approach checklist, and then any communications that you need to do. Moving on, number 8 is a long one. Procedural requirements. This is just specific to the VA and the 737. Procedural requirements, I'm only going to touch on one that's FAR related, which is your alternates. Again, you can Google that if you need more information. Generally speaking, it's the 1, 2, 3 rule. If the forecast weather at your destination is in at least 3 miles of visibility and 2,000 foot ceilings, but from 1 hour before to 1 hour after your ETA, your estimated time of arrival, you need to file an alternate. An alternate needs to be at least 600 foot ceiling and 2 miles of visibility at your estimated time of arrival if that airport has a precision approach, an ILS. If not, then and you're looking at only a non-precision approach like a VOR or an RNAV approach, then you're going to be looking at an 800 foot ceiling and 2 miles. We also follow alternates anytime the wind is a steady state of 35 knots or more, thunderstorms in the vicinity, or single runway operations like San Diego. And think about that. If there was a disabled aircraft on the runway in San Diego, you're not going to be able to land, are you? So we'll always follow an alternate for single runway operations. Cost index, this is one that comes up a lot. We always use 40 for the NG, 30 for the max. Now there are variable cost indexes, but we're not going to get into detail on that. That's just way too complicated for this sort of thing. Essentially, the higher the cost index, the faster you'll fly. The lower, the slower. You can play around with those, in fact, and see what those do to the aircraft. Look at the descent speeds, for instance. Auto brake policy. Anytime RCC is less than 6, so we'll say 5 good or less, which 5 good is wet. RVR of less than 4,000 feet or 3/4 of a mile, or if you're landing with less than flaps 30, auto brakes are required. Engine warm up and cool down times, keep those in mind for your flying. Latest touchdown point, something we always want to brief. The shortest of the 3,000 feet, 1/3 of the available landing distance, so on a 9,000 foot runway, that would be 3,000 feet. Or selected auto brake stopping margin plus 1,500 feet. Say your auto brake's 2 stopping margin was 500 feet and you decided to use auto brakes 2, your stopping margin or latest touchdown point is now 2,000 feet. So that would be the shortest of those 3. Flaps 40 are never required, but there are certain instances in which they are recommended shorter runways. Stopping margin for auto brakes 2 returns a 0 value. Then obviously flaps 40 are not good in gusty wind conditions. You got big pieces of metal out there. So we would come back and touch on cost index here. So again, cost index 40 for the NG and 30 for the max. Also, I just want to touch on another one that is often misunderstood is alternate. What do I put in my FMC for alternate fuel? What we'll do is the FA reserve plus alternate. So in this case, it would be 3.2, but we never do less than 4.4. So in this case, we would do 4.4. Say we had an alternate and our alternate fuel here was 3,000 pounds. 3,000 plus 3,200 would be 6.2. Number 10, landings. Stabilized approach, latest touchdown point. We're always looking at our latest touchdown point. Your landings, where everybody's working on trying to have better landings. Look at the far end of the runway. Start your flare at about 20 to 30 feet. Bring the power out and just a slight sink rate all the way down to touchdown. We've done videos on this. Stabilized approaches. Your stabilized approach criteria fully configured with the engine spooled by 1,000 feet AGL. Stabilized approaches lead to good landings. So make sure that you're stabilized at 1,000 feet. If not, go around. Final thoughts. This is just a summary here. Use your resources. Don't rush. Emphasis on pre-flight planning using LC5. Have current charts. Practice flying your routes offline. Know your aircraft. Communications brevity or communications etiquette. Flying ATC instructions. Remember, do not turn, do not climb, do not descend unless given an additional or a further instruction from ATC. Please don't do that on your own. If you're going to do that on your own, don't fly on the network. Understand the procedural requirements for the VA and are focused on improved landings. I hope that helps. There's other resources there. The Department of Training there for the virtual airline. They should be able to answer your questions and also any questions that you might have on Discord.